He watched the map in front of him as if the paper itself were defying him. The bombers had flown, the speeches had been made, the threats had been delivered, and still, something in London refused to bend. Around him, the room stayed quiet, too quiet, as if the silence itself had decided not to obey. In that quiet, a realization formed, not sudden, not loud, but cold, measured, and deeply inconvenient. He did not announce it. He rarely announced the thoughts that unsettled him most. Instead, he studied the situation with the same mixture of pride and irritation that had followed him since the first victories. Britain, to his mind, had been a problem that should have solved itself. Weakened, exposed, encircled by failure and retreat. And yet it did not collapse. Reports arrived in fragments. City fires contained more quickly than expected morale assessments that, while imperfect, hinted at resilience, intelligence briefings that described not desperation, but stubbornness. He listened without interrupting, eyes narrowing slightly. He had built his momentum on decisive movement. Britain, however, had chosen to answer movement with endurance. This was not the script he believed history would follow. In his thinking, pressure was supposed to force a choice, surrender or destruction. Instead, Britain did something more elusive. It absorbed pressure. It accepted punishment without yielding political control. The psychology of that unsettled him. A nation behaving as if pain itself could be managed, compartmentalized, survived. He considered the levers remaining to him: air, blockade, intimidation, diplomacy through fear. Each had already been engaged. Each had produced headlines, destruction, uncertainty, but not submission. If anything, the lack of surrender created a narrative he did not welcome, the idea that his will could be resisted, not by strength, but by refusal. In meetings, his tone grew cooler, less rhetorical, more analytical. Advisors spoke of logistics, losses, aircraft availability, readiness. He redirected the conversation toward something else: time. Britain was using time differently. While the bombing campaigns aimed to shorten the conflict, Britain appeared willing to lengthen it, to let the war become a test of endurance rather than speed. Endurance favors those who can wait. He did not say this aloud, but the thought lingered. A campaign meant to force negotiations was instead cementing resolve. Each new operation set expectations higher, as though victory would arrive simply by increasing intensity. But escalation without result creates its own trap. Once fear becomes normal, it stops working as intended. He sensed that trap forming. There was also the inconvenient strategic question. If Britain did not collapse, then what? A prolonged air campaign could continue, but air power alone was proving psychologically disruptive rather than decisively coercive. An invasion would be complex, risky, and dependent on naval strength he did not possess. Waiting risked inviting new opponents into the war, actors who could transform the entire balance of power. So he began to think in another direction, not toward surrender, but toward containment. Not toward forcing Britain to submit immediately, but toward isolating it, boxing it in, making it irrelevant. A shift in mindset, from breaking an enemy quickly to depriving it of options slowly. Yet acknowledging that shift, even internally, meant acknowledging something else. Britain had made a decision of its own. A quiet decision, not heroic in the cinematic sense. Simply firm. They would not surrender. He sat with that realization in silence for a moment longer than usual, allowing it to settle, then turned the conversation toward the next moves that would widen the conflict rather than close it. He believed widening would create leverage. He believed pressure elsewhere would eventually force London back to the table. But the decision forming in that room would carry consequences that reached far beyond Britain. Consequences he did not fully anticipate and could no longer control. The realization did not immediately change policy. It changed the tone beneath it. A leader who had built his authority on momentum now faced something that would not move, that did not fit the pattern. When patterns fracture, people around the center of power begin to adjust, carefully, cautiously, almost invisibly. Inside the briefings, he began to ask different questions. Not about triumphs, but about limits. Not about when Britain would break, but about what sustained it. Advisors spoke of geography, of industry dispersed rather than concentrated, of a government that had consolidated wartime powers while still speaking in the language of duty and endurance. The British population, they noted, did not believe surrender would bring safety. They believed it would bring occupation and humiliation. Fear, used repeatedly, had produced something other than collapse. It had hardened attitudes. He disliked hearing this, not because the information was false, but because it suggested that psychological warfare was not behaving as expected. He had long studied the effect of force on societies. Force, in his thinking, was a tool of persuasion. But persuasion fails when the opponent believes losing is worse than suffering. He walked through these insights silently, not inviting debate. Silence, in these moments, was not absence of thought. It was calculation. Silence hides doubt. Silence preserves authority. Gradually, his attention shifted to alternatives. If Britain would not submit, perhaps Britain could be rendered strategically irrelevant. That meant removing its potential partners, denying it allies, and ensuring that any future coalition would be too fractured to matter. Diplomats were tasked, quietly, with probing. Intelligence officers were told to assess vulnerabilities beyond the channel, not just across it. Pressure, he reasoned, could be displaced. Yet displacement carries risk. Opening new fronts, forming new ambitions, expanding commitments. These steps create illusion. Illusion of control. Illusion of inevitability. The more the conflict expands, the more variables enter the field. Variables do not obey speeches. The military planners around him sensed the shift too. The conversation no longer revolved around compelling Britain to sign a document. It turned toward how to endure Britain's continued presence while pursuing other objectives. A form of strategic compartmentalization. Britain would remain defiant, so be it. Let it stand. Work around it. Work past it. Force history to move elsewhere. But history does not move neatly. Britain, by refusing to surrender, altered timelines. It changed when decisions would have to be made. It slowed the war in one sense while accelerating it in another. Delay in one theater meant pressure to act in others. Waiting can become its own form of escalation. He sensed the irony, though he never acknowledged it aloud. His adversary's refusal to act, refusal to capitulate, refusal to end the war on his terms, was pushing him toward actions he had not yet fully mapped. That is the nature of strategic pressure. It is reciprocal, even when leaders pretend otherwise. The commanders reporting to him began asking for clarity. If the air campaign would not achieve decisive results, what was the next objective? Where should resources concentrate? Which risks were acceptable? His answers grew more conceptual, less precise. He spoke in terms of destiny, of opportunity, of the tendency of weak states to eventually collapse under broader continental realities. Concepts do not move armies. Orders do. In the gap between concept and execution, improvisation creeps in. Subordinates interpret intentions. They infer priorities. They compete to present solutions that align with perceived vision. Gradually, strategy becomes a mixture of ambition and assumption. Still powerful, still dangerous, but less grounded than before. In that gap, something subtle happened. The conflict began to widen, not because of a single calculated design, but because refusing to accept limits created a constant search for alternatives. And those alternatives, once chosen, would open doors that could not easily be closed. The map table became a stage where new possibilities were rehearsed. Not resolved, rehearsed. Britain remained there, fixed like a problem pinned to a board. The decision not to surrender had transformed it from an opponent to a constant, a variable that would not change, no matter how often the markers shifted around it. He began to consider the war not as a single contest, but as a sequence of interconnected pressures. If Britain could not be broken, perhaps it could be outflanked historically, not on the battlefield alone, but in perception. Victory, he told himself, might come not from compelling Britain to yield, but from making its refusal irrelevant in the face of larger events. That is when the conversations grew more speculative. Officers and ministers brought forward ideas that stretched beyond the immediate crisis. Control of resources, control of space, control of narratives across entire regions. The war, in their presentations, became less about forcing a single capitulation and more about redrawing the world so thoroughly that one defiant island simply ceased to matter. Ambition can masquerade as logic when spoken in calm voices. The strategic documents increasingly framed Britain as a problem to be contained rather than solved. Economic measures were projected, naval interdictions imagined, far-reaching diplomatic gambits drafted. Each proposal carried the same subtext: do not confront the stalemate directly. Change the framework until the stalemate dissolves. Yet each new layer also deepened commitment. Expanding objectives imposes invisible costs. More supply lines, more coordination, more assumptions about success. Once leaders begin thinking in terms of inevitable momentum, they stop asking the smaller, more disciplined question: what happens if we fail here, today, at this scale? Failure becomes abstract, and abstract failure is dangerous. Behind closed doors, a few voices hinted at caution. They noted that Britain's endurance was not merely political rhetoric. It was supported by industrial adaptation, tactical learning, and a growing sense of collective purpose among civilians. These reports were uncomfortable because they suggested that the longer the conflict continued, the stronger Britain might become, not weaker. He listened, but selectively. Doubt was permitted as data, not as influence. To outward audiences, speeches remained confident. They asserted inevitability. They framed British resistance as delusion, a temporary refusal to accept reality. Yet internally, policy had already shifted from swift coercion to prolonged management. That shift carried with it an unintended psychological change. The moment one accepts that an enemy will not break, the war becomes something else entirely. It becomes a contest of systems, of capacity, alliances, and time. He believed he could manage such a contest. Control had always been the central idea in his leadership. Control of pace, control of narrative, control of destiny. But control in extended conflicts becomes fragile. It must stretch across terrain, weather, morale, economics, and the unpredictable decisions of others. Stretch something long enough, and it begins to thin. Strategists around him proposed that widening the war might fracture opposing coalitions before they formed. Move first. Move decisively. Create facts that could not be reversed. Force others to react rather than plan. The reasoning sounded precise. It carried within it, however, a dangerous premise, that escalation itself could substitute for resolution. Escalation often feels like clarity until the consequences arrive. Britain, meanwhile, continued to endure. Not triumphantly, not always confidently, but consistently. Each night that cities survived, each day that government remained functioning, each broadcast that spoke in calm tones, all of it accumulated. Endurance does not announce itself with fanfare. It grows quietly, like weight added to a scale. He did not underestimate Britain entirely, but he misread the nature of its decision. He imagined stubbornness where there was strategy. He assumed emotion where there was calculation. To him, refusal seemed irrational. In reality, it was a deliberate acceptance of risk in order to avoid something worse. And as Britain accepted risk, he increased his own. Gradually, a sense emerged, not spoken, not written, but palpable, that the solution to his dilemma did not lie across the channel anymore. It lay elsewhere, somewhere beyond the immediate horizon, where a bold move might finally reassert control. He would look outward, farther than before, convinced that expansion could force the war back into his preferred rhythm. But when leaders search for control by widening the battlefield often begins to choose for them. Quietly, relentlessly, and without mercy. The outward narrative still insisted on inevitability. Speeches spoke of destiny, of encirclement, of an opponent standing alone and therefore doomed. But internally, strategy no longer rested on forcing Britain to submit. It rested on forcing the world to move around Britain, on shaping events so large that British defiance would eventually be overtaken, absorbed, diminished. That shift required confidence. It also required denial. He convinced himself that expanding pressure would restore initiative. Expansion meant resources, coordination, timing, risk layered upon risk. It required assuming that every new undertaking would succeed, or at least not fail catastrophically. Assumptions like that build quietly, like scaffolding around a structure whose foundations have not been fully tested. In closed meetings, maps spread wider. Arrows stretched farther. Objectives multiplied. Each proposed operation carried its own rationale, its own logic, its own story. Taken individually, they seemed plausible. Taken together, they revealed a leader determined not to confront one hard reality, Britain's refusal, and instead to surround it with motion. Movement can disguise uncertainty. It can also deepen it. Military planners voiced practical concerns: transport capacity, fuel reserves, industrial output, the increasing strain on repair and replacement. War fought at distance is war fought through logistics. And logistics are unforgiving. They do not respond to speeches or declarations. They respond to numbers, ports, railroads, production lines, weather. He acknowledged these realities without yielding to them. Resolve, he believed, could compensate for material limits. History, he imagined, rewarded those who refused to accept constraints. But constraints do not disappear. They accumulate. The decision to widen the conflict introduced new calculations, alliances, rivalries, uncertainties beyond his control. Britain, though battered, now had time. Time to coordinate, time to seek support, time to transform endurance into strategy. While he moved outward, Britain slowly knitted itself into something larger than itself. He underestimated what time can do when it is used deliberately. The psychology inside his circle remained disciplined on the surface. Doubts were translated into technical language. Risks were measured, categorized, then often set aside with a reassuring phrase about momentum. The idea persisted that once the next step succeeded, pressure would finally return to Britain and force a reconsideration of its refusal. Next step. Always the next step. In quieter moments, however, some sensed the contradiction. A campaign launched to compel surrender was now generating conditions that made surrender less likely. Bombing had hardened resolve. Isolation had encouraged alliances. Threats had clarified moral boundaries. Britain's refusal had become not just an act of survival, but a symbol others could rally around. Symbols are not easily coerced. He continued to believe that decisive movement elsewhere would unbalance everything. A breakthrough beyond Britain, he thought, would alter psychology across the continent. Once power was demonstrated again, clearly, dramatically, London would eventually return to negotiation, not because it wished to, but because history would have cornered it. That belief, quietly held and rarely challenged, drove preparations forward. But history does not corner on command. It bends through interlocking decisions, each carrying costs that are easier to justify before they are paid. And every expansion of the war opened new paths that could not easily be reversed, even if doubt later emerged. The map table grew crowded with possibilities, each promising resolution, each requiring deeper commitment, each carrying consequences that no one in the room could fully see. He told himself that control was still within reach. Yet even as he did, the conflict was beginning to evolve beyond any single hand, reshaping itself into something larger, slower, and far more unpredictable than the swift victory he once imagined. By now, the conflict no longer resembled the clean, linear campaign imagined at its outset. It had become layered, military on top of political, political on top of ideological, ideology wrapped around fear. Britain's refusal still sat at the center, quiet and stubborn, like a locked door he refused to acknowledge directly. Instead of facing it, strategy circled around it again and again. Circling creates the illusion of progress. He studied the reports with a practiced stillness. Production figures, bombing assessments, intelligence intercepts, diplomatic cables. Each sheet of paper became another attempt to translate uncertainty into numbers, to make the war feel measurable, predictable, controllable. But beneath the numbers lay something harder to grasp: will. And will cannot be graphed. He had once believed that shock would break will. Shock from rapid conquest. Shock from air raids. Shock from threats delivered with calm finality. Those shocks had indeed unsettled, frightened, destroyed. But they had also clarified something unexpected, that the cost of surrender might be greater than the cost of resistance. That inversion troubled him, though he did not say so. Within his circle, the conversations shifted toward justification. Why each widening move was necessary. Why each risk was rational. Why the path now taken had been inevitable all along. Leaders do this when uncertainty grows. They rewrite the narrative so that doubt appears as confidence in retrospect. Confidence, however, does not repair overstretch. His generals increasingly spoke of balancing acts. Fuel against distance. Aircraft against attrition. Troops against terrain. Everything required trade-offs. Every new promise of decisive action required pulling strength from somewhere else. Britain's endurance, meanwhile, cost him something more subtle than resources. It cost him strategic patience. He did not want to wait. Waiting felt like weakness. So planning accelerated. Schedules tightened. Operations layered upon operations, as if momentum itself could erase the sense of stalemate across the channel. He began speaking more often about destiny again, not only as rhetoric, but as insulation against the uncomfortable truth that Britain had made a decision he could not undo through pressure alone. Destiny can be a refuge when reality resists. Meanwhile, British broadcasts continued, measured, steady, sometimes grim, rarely triumphant. They did not promise easy victory. They promised endurance. Civilians rebuilt. Crews trained. Systems adapted. Slowly, painfully, Britain was converting survival into capacity. The longer it refused to collapse, the more others noticed. He recognized this, at least in fragments. A prolonged conflict risked attracting stronger adversaries, ones not yet fully mobilized but capable of transforming the balance when they chose to act. That possibility should have argued for caution. Instead, it argued, in his mind, for acting faster elsewhere, striking before time closed the window. Speed as defense. Expansion as reassurance. It was here that the war became deeply psychological. His belief in his own intuition strengthened precisely as the strategic environment became more complex. Doubt from subordinates began to sound like obstruction. Warnings began to feel like hesitation. The circle around him tightened, not physically, but intellectually. Fewer questions. Fewer alternative views. More certainty voiced with quiet conviction. And still, across the water, Britain endured. Not because it was unafraid, but because it had already committed to the idea that surrender would only invite something darker. That recognition, clear to observers, clear to historians, clear to those living through it, never fully registered in his calculations. He saw resistance. He did not see the logic behind it. As spring turned into planning cycles and planning cycles turned into deadlines, one conclusion hardened within him. If Britain could not be bent quickly, it would be bypassed, strategically, geographically, historically. The war would expand not as a single dramatic leap, but as a series of interlocking decisions, each one narrowing the path back to restraint. And once that path narrows far enough, leaders stop noticing it altogether. He stood over the maps again, tracing lines that reached far beyond the island that refused him, convinced that somewhere in those lines lay the decisive move that would restore control. The room was quiet, attentive, expectant, waiting for direction that would set the next chain of consequences in motion. He believed he was opening doors to opportunity. In reality, he was approaching doors that, once crossed, would lock behind him, quietly, irrevocably, and at immense cost. By the time the final shape of strategy emerged, it no longer resembled a single choice. It looked like inevitability. Each earlier decision, each adjustment, each refusal to accept limits had quietly guided him toward a point where options appeared narrower, harsher, more absolute. Britain had not been defeated. It had been endured, and in enduring, it had forced the war into a wider, colder frame. He rarely admitted turning points, even to himself. But there was a moment, small, almost unremarkable, when he accepted that the immediate confrontation across the Channel would remain unresolved. Not lost. Not won. Suspended. And in that suspended space, he sought meaning elsewhere. He convinced himself that expansion was not reaction, but vision. That he was not compensating for failure, but accelerating destiny. Destiny is seductive precisely because it absolves leaders of doubt. The advisors around him prepared their briefings with greater care. They learned to speak in terms that affirmed rather than questioned. Operational risks became temporary obstacles. Strategic uncertainties were repackaged as temporary disadvantages that would vanish once the next move succeeded. In this language, caution sounded almost disloyal. Discipline, increasingly, meant alignment. He listened to it all with a calm exterior that practiced stillness that conveyed mastery. But beneath the stillness lay a growing dependence on momentum. Action created reassurance. Reassurance justified more action. And every new step rested on the premise that the world would continue to behave according to his expectations. The world, however, was quietly organizing itself against him. Britain, once isolated, was drawing strength from connections that had not yet fully formed but were already taking shape. Industrial coordination, intelligence sharing, political commitments that grew more explicit with each month of survival. Britain's refusal to surrender, once framed as stubbornness, was becoming proof that resistance was viable. Proof has power. It spreads. He underestimated how symbols travel faster than armies. As the strategic horizon widened, he began to speak of inevitability again, not just to the public, but inside the room. He framed upcoming operations as decisive, necessary, historically mandated. The vocabulary of choice faded. The vocabulary of must replaced it. When leaders start speaking in absolutes, they often do so because alternatives have become psychologically intolerable. Admitting miscalculation would have meant revisiting earlier assumptions, the limits of air power, the resilience of societies under pressure, the capacity of democracies to mobilize under threat. Instead, he doubled down on the premise that control would return with one more decisive move, one more shock large enough to force the world into alignment. But shocks, once normalized, lose their authority. Meanwhile, Britain continued to rebuild. Not quickly, not cleanly, but steadily. Factories dispersed. Systems hardened. Civilians adapted to a rhythm of survival that became, in its own way, a form of quiet strength. The refusal to surrender was no longer a decision made in crisis. It had become part of national identity. Identity outlasts campaigns. He sensed this shift without fully understanding it. The conflict he had imagined as short, transactional, mechanical, defeat imposed, surrender accepted, had transformed into something deeply psychological. Will against will, system against system, time against time, and time was beginning to favor those who could absorb blows rather than those who needed immediate results. So he committed fully, irreversibly, to strategies that reached far beyond the island that had first defied him. He believed that by widening the war, he could compress it. By spreading pressure outward, he could finally force capitulation inward. In doing so, he crossed from calculated risk into structural gamble, a gamble that required every subsequent decision to justify the last. There is a point in every conflict when leaders no longer ask what success costs. They ask only what failure would reveal. He had reached that point. Britain had not surrendered, and because it had not surrendered, the war that might have ended in negotiation would now expand into something far more destructive, far more complex, far less controllable. His realization that Britain would not yield did not end the conflict. It reshaped it, and as the maps widened, as plans deepened, as the machinery of war prepared for yet another escalation, the quiet truth lingered in the background, simple, unspoken, and impossible to reverse. A decision made in silence on one side of the channel was about to change the fate of continents.